Madrid, the year 1834. The palace is heavy with incense and beeswax, as though the very air is conspiring to smother grief. You are a royal physician, summoned not to heal, but to preserve. The king, Ferdinand VII, is dead. Yet your work has only just begun. In the hushed gloom of his chamber, the queen regent, Maria Cristina, stands draped in black, her cheeks wet with tears. Her gaze fixes on you, steady yet trembling with unspoken command. The task she entrusts to you is grotesque, unprecedented, and perilous to both body and soul: preserve the most infamous part of Spain's late monarch. You hesitate, for the request is as chilling as it is absurd. But refusal is impossible. A physician's oath binds you to duty, the queen's authority binds you to obedience. Your hands tremble as you draw back the silk sheet from the corpse, and even in death Ferdinand's presence dominates the room. His face, pale and slackened, seems almost to sneer, a last mockery from a man who terrorized his kingdom for 2 decades. But your eyes are drawn downward, to the anatomical monstrosity whispered about in palace corridors for years. Here lies the organ that shaped not just his marriages but his reign, a grotesquely oversized, twisted appendage that had been both his shame and his weapon. To touch it is to touch the physical embodiment of a reign warped by excess and paranoia. It is a relic that future physicians will hide in archives, a specimen too dangerous for public knowledge yet too extraordinary to destroy. As you prepare the tools of preservation, cloths, jars, spirits, you cannot help but think of what this object represents. Spain itself, swollen by empire, bent and deformed by centuries of inbreeding, now reduced to something at once pitiable and horrifying. The Queen's request, though clothed in piety, is political. In monarchies, the body of a king is never just flesh. It is symbol. It carries the legitimacy of dynasties, the continuity of power, and in Ferdinand's case, the scandal of failure. To preserve his body, even the most private part of it, is to preserve the memory of rule, however corrupt. You realize you are embalming not only a man but an era. Outside the palace walls, Madrid is restless. The year 1834 is marked not only by royal death but by plague, hunger, and whispers of rebellion. The streets stink of cholera. Families carry their dead to mass graves, while carriages rattle through narrow alleys where beggars cling to life. Spain is a kingdom fractured, its colonies slipping away, its people exhausted, its future uncertain. And yet within these walls, you are asked to devote yourself to this obscene relic, as though by preserving it you might hold back the decay of Spain itself. As you dip your cloth into the solution, you recall the whispers that circulated in life, special cushions, wives who screamed in terror, miscarriages that ended in blood and despair. Physicians like you at once designed elaborate contraptions to make marital duties survivable. Court alchemists sold potions promising fertility, while astrologers charted stars for auspicious nights. And still, Spain remained heirless, haunted by the deformity of its king's body. Each failure to produce a child echoed in the streets, where rumor became rebellion and private shame became public disorder. This moment, your trembling hands upon the cold flesh, compresses decades of whispered scandal into a single act. You are not merely preserving tissue. You are preserving the grotesque symbol of a monarchy that devoured itself. Ferdinand's member is more than anatomy, it is metaphor. Too large to function, too strange to fulfill its purpose, too cursed to pass on life. A perfect emblem of a dynasty whose bloodlines, once the pride of Europe, had curdled into deformity. You glance at Queen Maria Cristina. She is silent, watching, perhaps already plotting how to turn this morbid preservation into a weapon of legitimacy for her daughter Isabella, the fragile child who must inherit this fractured throne. You sense the irony: the king's monstrous anatomy, which destroyed his marriages and his dynasty, will now be embalmed as if it were a relic of sainthood. Spain will whisper, the Vatican will hide the evidence, and you, royal physician, will be remembered by no one. Only your trembling hands will know the truth, that the fate of a kingdom was shaped by flesh, shame, and silence. The silk sheets are drawn over the king once more. Your task has begun. The story of Ferdinand must now be told, not as chronicles wrote it, but as it truly unfolded, through suffering, betrayal, and the secret that defined a reign deformed. To understand Ferdinand VII, one must return to his birth, October 14, 1784, within the cold marble walls of El Escorial. He entered the world already marked, not by witchcraft or divine curse, but by a lineage that had folded in on itself for centuries. The Spanish Bourbons, like the Habsburgs before them, had made a habit of marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, sealing alliances with blood that grew ever thinner with each generation. Royal genealogies resembled spirals rather than branches, and Ferdinand was born at the center of that spiral. His father, Charles IV, had neither the temperament nor the mind to govern. A king in name, he preferred the hunt, the open fields, and the sound of musket fire echoing through Spanish forests. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, wielded appetites of a different sort. Bold, domineering, and openly entwined with her lover and political ally Manuel de Godoy, she reduced her husband to a symbol while she pursued power through intrigue. Ferdinand's parents, though monarchs, were first cousins, just one more link in the chain of consanguinity that had long cursed Spain's crown. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start. Europe whispered about Spain's royal deformities, though never allowed in diplomatic chambers. The Habsburg jaw, that grotesque protrusion of bone caused by inbreeding, had already disfigured generations of rulers. Madness, infertility, and premature death stalked royal nurseries like invisible assassins. By the time Ferdinand was born, such defects were less accident than expectation. He was not merely a child, he was a symptom of dynastic decay. And yet, for all the pomp of his baptism, with choirs thundering in Latin and silver fonts gleaming in candlelight, there was unease. Court astrologers read his horoscope with careful words, neither damning nor praising. Physicians noted his frailty. Servants whispered of his mother's brazenness, his father's weakness, and the inevitable inheritance of both. Even in his cradle, Ferdinand was less a promise than a warning. In the late 18th century, the Enlightenment had already reached Madrid. Books smuggled from Paris and Geneva questioned monarchy itself, spoke of rights, constitutions, and nations. Intellectuals who gathered in salons murmured about reason and progress, but their eyes always returned to the palace, to the royal children who embodied Spain's fate. For in that era, a king was not only a ruler but a living metaphor. His body was the state's body, his fertility, the nation's future. If he was strong, Spain might recover. If he was weak, Spain would fall. Ferdinand grew beneath this burden, unaware at first, but watched by many. His body became an object of scrutiny from his earliest years. What others might have seen as innocence was, to the physicians and courtiers around him, a series of ominous signs. Too quiet? Perhaps he inherited his father's dullness. Too restless? A hint of his mother's volatility. And when the first whispers began about his developing anatomy, unnatural growth, a grotesque shape, the gossip fused with the larger narrative of Spain's decay. This child, they said, was the flesh and blood emblem of a kingdom collapsing under its own lineage. Spain at that moment was already in decline. Its empire stretched wide on maps but was rotting at the edges. Silver shipments from the Americas grew thin, revolts stirred in colonies, the navy was battered by Britain, and France's revolution was reshaping Europe's order. Into this storm, the Bourbons placed their hopes on a boy who was neither brilliant nor beautiful, but instead a vessel of whispered shame. His very body would be read as a metaphor, twisted into prophecy, and turned into a legend darker than any court poet could have imagined. Ferdinand was not born cursed by the stars, but by history itself. Generations of royal unions made not for love nor even affection, but for treaties and dynastic convenience, had created a living relic of decline. The infant swaddled in silk at El Escorial was already bound by chains invisible yet unbreakable, the chains of blood, expectation, and decay. As Ferdinand grew from child to adolescent, his world narrowed into a theater of whispers and stares. The palace was not merely a home but a stage upon which every gesture, every word, and every bodily peculiarity was observed, catalogued, and repeated. Servants traded jokes behind fans, courtiers exchanged knowing glances, and foreign diplomats sent back coded reports about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand's most intimate shame had become public currency, passed along with gossip about wars, ministers, and mistresses. His father, Charles IV, gave him little strength to draw upon. Charles was a man of the hunt, more comfortable in forests with hounds and muskets than in council chambers with statesmen. Weak-willed and indecisive, he allowed himself to be eclipsed by others. His mother, Maria Luisa, filled the vacuum with her voracious appetites, both political and personal. Her open liaison with Manuel de Godoy, the so-called Prince of Peace and de facto ruler of Spain, humiliated the royal family daily. Ferdinand watched his father reduced to a cipher, his mother ruling with a lover's whisper, and Godoy swelling with titles, lands, and influence. To a boy already marked by ridicule, the spectacle of betrayal taught him an early lesson. Power was not about loyalty or love but about domination and survival. His tutors, tasked with shaping the prince into a monarch, noted troubling changes as he reached adolescence. He became secretive, prone to vindictive outbursts, quick to punish perceived slights. Servants who made minor mistakes were dismissed or flogged. One court chaplain recorded a chilling incident. When a young page accidentally entered the prince's chamber while Ferdinand was changing, the boy did not simply lose his position, he was publicly whipped, and his family was exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable: no one could witness Ferdinand's shame and live without consequence. Cruelty became his shield against mockery. Psychologists today would call it the logic of the humiliated, to control others ruthlessly in order to conceal one's own vulnerability. For Ferdinand, his body was a prison from which he could not escape. The laughter he imagined behind bowed heads, the murmurs in corridors, the silences after his entry into a room, these became obsessions. His paranoia was not unfounded. People truly were talking about him. But Ferdinand learned to amplify suspicion until it encompassed everyone, until even respectful gestures seemed veiled insults. The wider culture of the Spanish court magnified these anxieties. The late 18th century Bourbon court was a place where wit could be as deadly as steel, where reputations were destroyed not only by scandal but by satire. Courtiers trained in the art of double meaning sharpened their tongues on easy targets, and the prince's affliction provided endless material. In an era when classical ideals still dominated notions of masculine beauty, the lean, controlled physiques of Greek statuary, Ferdinand's grotesque anomaly marked him as unnatural. What modern men might consider a sign of virility was, in that context, a badge of deformity. Adolescence hardened him. His interactions became less about friendship or trust and more about control. If others laughed, he would wield fear. If he could not inspire admiration, he would enforce obedience. And always, behind the mask of cruelty, lay the festering wound of humiliation. The whispers in the palace corridors were not just courtly gossip, they were the echo chamber that shaped a king in waiting. Spain was preparing, unknowingly, for a ruler whose deepest lessons were those of paranoia, resentment, and punishment. The boy who once cowered from laughter was becoming a man who would make others cower in return. Ferdinand had learned early that power could mask weakness, and humiliation, if wielded like a blade, could be passed down from the mock to the multitude. The young prince, warped by ridicule, was already on the path to becoming a tyrant. By the time Ferdinand reached late adolescence, his condition had become not only a personal torment but a medical obsession. Court physicians, sworn to discretion, recorded their observations in notebooks that were passed hand to hand like forbidden texts. One noted with clinical detachment that the prince's organ was of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that marital congress may prove hazardous. Another was blunter, comparing it to a billiard cue, thin at the base, grotesquely swollen at the extremity, long enough to serve as a walking stick. The tone of these reports mixed awe with unease, as though the prince were less a patient than a specimen. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine was a marketplace as much as a science. Madrid teemed with practitioners, barber surgeons who still clung to medieval traditions, physicians schooled in the new anatomical academies, and itinerant healers promising remedies imported from the Orient. The Enlightenment had begun to shape medical thought, but humoral theories lingered, and alchemy still whispered at the edges of practice. Ferdinand, desperate to be normal, became a perfect quarry for charlatans. He swallowed powders of crushed pearls, rhinoceros horn, and exotic herbs. He drank bitter concoctions that promised to shrink or strengthen. He smeared unguents of mercury and musk on his skin. Each potion was expensive, none effective, but all fed his hope that the curse might be lifted. His desperation was not merely physical. In an age when a prince's worth was measured by his ability to father heirs, Ferdinand's deformity was more than private shame, it was a national crisis waiting to unfold. Monarchies lived or died by fertility, and barren unions could topple dynasties. The Spanish court, already haunted by the collapse of its empire abroad, viewed its heir with nervous calculation. Could this prince fulfill his duty? Or would Spain face the nightmare of a throne without succession? Physicians were pressured to find answers, even if their methods bordered on the absurd. Some devised elaborate contraptions, special cushions, supports, and straps crafted in the workshops of royal artisans. These devices, described euphemistically as marital aids, blurred the line between medical instrument and torture device. A saddlemaker who once crafted hunting gear for Charles IV found himself commissioned to build contraptions for the prince's bedroom. Behind closed doors, the artisans of Madrid whispered that they were constructing tools not for pleasure but for survival. The wider European medical community, too, was fascinated. Reports filtered to Rome, Vienna, and Paris, where physicians speculated about the Spanish case. Some imagined it as divine punishment for Bourbon decadence, others treated it as a problem of natural philosophy, a living example of monstrous growth. In private academies, lectures on anomalies of the body sometimes invoked him without naming him. Ferdinand was becoming not just a patient, but a legend of pathology. For Ferdinand himself, the endless experiments and failures deepened his paranoia. Each failed cure confirmed his suspicion that others were laughing, that physicians used him for their own gain, that foreign doctors mocked him in their reports. He lashed out at attendants, dismissed servants without warning, and grew increasingly suspicious of those closest to him. His body, impossible to control, had become a mirror of his kingdom, swollen, twisted, unable to function as intended. And just as Spain sought remedies for its fading empire in half-remembered traditions and desperate alliances, Ferdinand sought salvation in quackery, superstition, and deceit. The prince consumed remedies with the same fervor his ancestors had consumed power. And like them, he found that once squandered, health and authority alike could not be restored by alchemy. Yet hope, the cruelest medicine of all, kept him searching. Each vial, each powder, each whispered ritual carried the promise of cure, and each failure left him more broken, more bitter, and more determined to bend others to his will. In 1802, the court celebrated what seemed the perfect solution to the dynasty's anxiety, a marriage between Ferdinand and his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. She was barely 17, intelligent, lively, and raised in the gilded expectation of royal romance. Ferdinand was called El Deseado, the desired one by his supporters, and she arrived in Madrid imagining she would be swept into a fairy tale of duty, power, and affection. The wedding itself glittered with magnificence. The cathedral swelled with organ music, bells rang across Madrid, and the streets filled with revelers. Processions wound through plazas where commoners shouted blessings on their young prince and his radiant bride. To the people, the union represented hope, that through fertility, Spain might secure its future against decline. Behind the spectacle, however, preparations of a very different kind were underway. Royal weddings ended at the altar, but dynasties were secured in the bridal chamber. Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting found themselves confronted with strange requests, custom-made cushions, jars of oils and salves, and implements that seemed more suited to a physician's table than a marriage bed. They were told this was customary, part of the mysterious rites of royal unions. The young princess, sheltered in her upbringing, had no reason to question it. Her education had been typical of royal women, fluent in languages, schooled in etiquette and piety, but utterly unprepared for the realities of conjugal life. The truth became unavoidable on her wedding night. When Ferdinand disrobed, the sight of his grotesquely malformed anatomy sent the girl into hysteria. Witnesses recalled her screaming, retreating against the chamber wall, crying monstruo, monstruo, as though confronted by a devil. Physicians were called in, as if for an emergency surgery rather than a consummation. The special cushions were placed, oils applied, and what followed resembled a medical procedure more than an act of intimacy. For Maria Antonia, the experience was trauma. Her innocence had collided with something she could neither comprehend nor endure. Laudanum was soon administered to calm her. Over time, she became dependent on it, using the drug to dull the terror of repeated encounters. Each attempt at consummation was a ritual of dread, physicians preparing the bed, attendants standing by with remedies, the young queen dosed into submission. Far from producing heirs, the process eroded her health, body, and spirit. The political stakes were immense. Royal fertility was not merely private, it was the machinery of state. A queen who failed to produce an heir could destabilize a kingdom, a king unable to fulfill his duty could delegitimize a dynasty. Behind the palace walls, the Spanish elite grew nervous. Every miscarriage Maria Antonia suffered was cloaked in vague explanations about her delicate constitution, but the truth was whispered nonetheless. The prince's deformity made conception nearly impossible. The monarchy's survival was bound to a bedroom tragedy. Ferdinand, humiliated by his wife's visible revulsion, interpreted her suffering as betrayal. He convinced himself that her failures were deliberate, that she resisted out of malice, perhaps even out of secret political sympathies. Already paranoid, he began to see treason in her very tears. Instead of compassion, he met her with suspicion. For Maria Antonia, each miscarriage was not only a personal loss but a source of accusation, another turn of the screw in a marriage that offered no reprieve. The palace, with its golden ceilings and mirrored halls, became a prison of fear. The queen, once bright and hopeful, was reduced to a shadow, haunted by laudanum dreams and the grotesque ritual of forced intimacy. The king, wounded by shame, turned cruelty into armor. Their union, celebrated in the plazas as Spain's hope, became in truth a silent battlefield of pain and mistrust. What Spain had witnessed as spectacle, a young couple radiant with promise, was, in reality, a nightmare behind closed doors. And as the marriage faltered, so too did the illusion that Ferdinand could ever embody the renewal his subjects longed for. As months turned to years, the young queen withered beneath the weight of her marriage. The laudanum that once quieted her terror became a constant crutch. She dosed herself before every summons to the royal chamber, her body growing ever more dependent on the drug. Each miscarriage deepened her despair. Physicians recorded her fainting spells, her bouts of nervous agitation, her weight loss. In the language of the time, she was a woman of delicate constitution. In truth, she was a victim of unrelenting trauma. Her marriage to Ferdinand had become a theater of ritualized cruelty. Physicians prepared the chamber as though for surgery, cushions and straps awaited her, along with her husband's paranoia. When conception failed again and again, Ferdinand blamed her rather than himself. He accused her of sabotaging pregnancies, of ingesting secret powders, of secretly aligning with liberals and enemies of Spain. Every loss was reframed as conspiracy. Every scream, every sob, every fainting fit became, in his eyes, evidence of treason against both him and the crown. By 1807, Maria Antonia was only 21 but appeared decades older. Her body was ravaged by addiction, her spirit eroded by humiliation. In her final months she spent long hours in prayer, whispering to saints for forgiveness for sins she could not name. Those close to her described her as a ghost, present but hollow, moving through palace halls with the vacant eyes of someone already half in the grave. In May of that year, she died. The official cause was fever, complications of her fragile health. But no one in Madrid believed such a simple explanation. Rumors sprouted like weeds in the palace gardens. Some whispered she had wasted away from laudanum excess. Others claimed she had been poisoned. The finger of suspicion pointed not only to political enemies, but toward Ferdinand himself. Had he grown tired of a wife who could not give him an heir? Was her death convenient, allowing him to seek a more fruitful match? Fueling the rumors was the sudden death of the royal apothecary just days later. Found lifeless in his chambers, he left behind a cryptic letter that was seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. What had he confessed? Some said it contained proof that Maria Antonia had been slowly poisoned. Others believed it revealed the horrifying truth about Ferdinand's condition and the impossible demands placed upon his wife. Whatever its contents, its disappearance ensured that speculation would never cease. Ferdinand's behavior after her death did little to quiet the whispers. He performed the expected gestures of grief in public, solemn masses, carefully staged appearances, but privately he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks, he began inquiring after potential brides, focusing on women who had already borne children and thus proven their fertility. His courtiers, accustomed to the speed with which power reshaped propriety, took the hint: mourning would be short, and the hunt for a new queen would be swift. The tragedy of Maria Antonia was swallowed by the machinery of monarchy. To the court, she was merely a failed vessel, a womb that had not produced. To her ladies, she was a broken young woman, consumed by laudanum and despair. To Ferdinand, she was a discarded tool, no longer useful in his pursuit of an heir. In the cold calculus of dynastic politics, her suffering was an inconvenience, her death, an opportunity. But her ghost lingered. Whispers of her screams, her wasted body, her suspicious end haunted the corridors of Madrid. They became cautionary tales murmured by servants, material for foreign diplomats' dispatches, fodder for the pamphlets of liberals who already despised Ferdinand. A young queen had been sacrificed to a malformed king and a broken dynasty, and Spain would pay the price in scars that reached far beyond the walls of the palace. In the wake of Maria Antonia's death, Ferdinand's paranoia found new channels. His grief had been shallow, but his suspicions deepened. He had already learned to see others not as companions but as tools, and now, widowed and embittered, he became the center of a web of intrigue. Spain itself was unraveling. The monarchy under Charles IV and Manuel de Godoy staggered from crisis to crisis: military defeats, financial collapse, and the looming presence of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose army shadowed Europe like an approaching storm. Within this maelstrom, factions of nobles and officers sought salvation not from the king, but from the prince. They called themselves Fernandinos. To them, Ferdinand was el deseado, the desired one, an image carefully crafted in pamphlets and whispers. He was portrayed as the antidote to Godoy's corruption, the hope of a rejuvenated Spain. They spread stories of his supposed intelligence, his patriotism, his piety. But beneath the propaganda, even his allies knew the truth: Ferdinand was unstable, suspicious, and consumed by his private humiliations. Still, for desperate men, he was useful. The conspiracy coalesced at El Escorial, the vast palace monastery outside Madrid. Here, plots were hatched in hushed corridors, letters exchanged in cipher, and visions of a coup took form. The plan was bold: Ferdinand would lead a faction to depose his father and Godoy, seizing the crown with Napoleon's tacit support. For a moment, it seemed possible. Spain's nobility despised Godoy, the army simmered with discontent, and France's shadow offered both threat and promise. But conspiracies rarely stay secret. By October 1807, word of the plot reached Charles IV. The response was swift and devastating. The king's guard stormed into Ferdinand's quarters, uncovering letters that revealed not only the plot but the prince's direct appeals to Napoleon himself. The desired one had sought favor from the very foreign power Spaniards most feared. The patriot had begged a conqueror for assistance in dethroning his own father. Faced with exposure, Ferdinand revealed his true nature. He did not stand by his allies. He did not defend their cause. Instead, he turned on them. He confessed everything, naming every noble, every officer, every conspirator who had pledged themselves to his scheme. He begged his parents for forgiveness, painting himself as a misled boy, corrupted by men of ambition. His allies, those who had risked their estates, their reputations, even their lives, were left to imprisonment and exile. Ferdinand saved himself by sacrificing all around him. This moment set a pattern that would define his reign. Loyalty meant nothing to him, gratitude was an empty word. He would use people until they no longer served his purpose, then discard them without hesitation. His cowardice was as corrosive as his cruelty. Even Napoleon, who received Ferdinand's letters, is said to have remarked on the pathetic eagerness of the Spanish prince, a man willing to barter his honor for a crown he could not hold. The El Escorial conspiracy revealed Ferdinand not as a hero in waiting but as a betrayer in training. He learned that survival required confession, that betrayal could be weaponized, that even the closest allies could be sacrificed if it meant clinging to power. For his followers, it was a lesson in disillusionment. For Spain, it was a glimpse of the king he would one day become, a man who would turn suspicion into policy, betrayal into routine, and cowardice into the foundation of his rule. The prince who could not control his own body had discovered another means of control, destroying those who trusted him. In 1808, the fragile facade of Bourbon authority finally shattered. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, saw Spain not as an ally but as prey. The monarchy was divided: Charles IV despised his own son, Ferdinand schemed against his father, and Manuel de Godoy clung desperately to influence. Into this chaos marched the French. What began as an alliance soon became occupation, and Madrid simmered with rage. The crisis reached its climax in the spring. In Bayonne, under the watchful eye of Napoleon himself, both Charles IV and Ferdinand were forced to abdicate. Spain's throne, once glittering with imperial legacy, was handed like a trinket to the French emperor, who placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte upon it. The proud line of Spanish kings was humiliated, reduced to pawns in a continental game. For Ferdinand, the desired one, it was a catastrophe beyond imagining. He had not only lost the crown he craved, but done so in a manner that exposed his cowardice to all of Europe. Dragged from prince to prisoner, Ferdinand was sent deep into France, confined in the Château de Valençay. There, far from the crowds of Madrid, his deformity became a subject of foreign fascination. French physicians, less bound by Spanish protocol and secrecy, examined him with the cool detachment of scientists. They probed, measured, and documented his anatomy with clinical precision. For them, the king without a throne was less a sovereign than a case study. In their reports, buried in Napoleonic archives, his condition was described with unnerving clarity, an organ so deformed it seemed a relic from mythology rather than nature. They theorized about rare hormonal disorders, congenital malformations, and the cumulative effects of inbreeding. To Ferdinand, these examinations were torture. To the French, they were science. Meanwhile, Spain burned. In Madrid, the people rose in revolt on May 2, unleashing a brutal insurrection against French troops. Across the country, guerrilla bands took to the hills, ambushing convoys, harassing soldiers, bleeding the empire's mightiest army with 1,000 cuts. The Peninsular War had begun, and Spaniards fought not for Charles or Ferdinand, but for their own survival. Ironically, while peasants and patriots died in muddy fields, the man they claimed as king dined under French chandeliers, obsessing over his private shame and dreaming of restoration. Letters from Valençay reveal a man detached from reality. He wrote incessantly to European courts, inquiring about potential brides who might overlook his condition. He obsessed over remedies, requested physicians, and devised rituals to restore his potency. While his subjects starved, he catalogued his failures in ink and sealed them with wax, as if his reproductive dilemma were the central crisis of Europe. To those who smuggled news of him back to Spain, Ferdinand was a symbol of legitimacy, the rightful king languishing in captivity. To those who saw him closely, he was a hollow man, consumed by fear, shame, and self-pity. His captivity stripped away the last illusions. No longer could Ferdinand pretend to be the desired one. He was a monarch without a crown, a patient without a cure, a man whose body betrayed him at every turn. And yet, fate would conspire to restore him. Not through his own strength or cunning, but through the blood and sacrifice of a nation that fought in his name while he cowered in exile. Spain bled for a king unworthy of its devotion. When he returned, it would not be to redeem their faith, but to betray it once more. In 1814, after 6 humiliating years in French captivity, Ferdinand returned to Spain. His carriage rolled through the gates of Madrid to scenes that seemed torn from a biblical parable of restoration. Crowds wept openly, women tossed flowers at his feet, children knelt in reverence. Bells rang from steeples, priests led processions, and the streets echoed with chants of Viva el Deseado. For a nation that had endured invasion, famine, and war, the king's return embodied deliverance. He was hailed as the savior of Spain, the chosen one for whom so many had bled and died. But the man who stepped down from the carriage was not a savior. He was a prisoner of his body, a captive of his paranoia, and a monarch incapable of compassion. Behind the royal smile, Ferdinand's first thoughts were not of rebuilding Spain, rewarding the patriots, or honoring the liberal Cortes of Cádiz who had drafted a constitution in his name. His thoughts were of himself, his shame, his need for an heir, his hunger to control what mocked him most. Within weeks, Ferdinand annulled the 1812 constitution, silencing the liberal dream of constitutional monarchy. What followed was the Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. Censorship returned, prisons filled with dissenters, and inquisitors once more whispered in darkened halls. Spain, already exhausted, found itself plunged back into repression under the very man it had fought to restore. The irony was savage. A people who had risen in their own defense now found themselves ruled by the tyrant they had longed for. Yet Ferdinand's tyranny was shaped as much by his personal obsession as by politics. His first act as restored king was not a sweeping reform or a declaration of gratitude, but a commission for new marital devices. He sent agents across Europe, to Germany, to Italy, even to the Ottoman court, in search of artisans skilled in creating instruments for delicate royal circumstances. Workshops hidden in the palace churned with activity, crafting cushions, restraints, and elaborate contraptions that blended medical ingenuity with grotesque fantasy. To Ferdinand, the survival of his dynasty depended not on constitutions or armies, but on the secret arsenal of his bedchamber. The choice of his second wife reflected this desperation. In 1816, he married Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the endless spiral of Bourbon inbreeding. She was 19. Filled with the naive hope of a young princess raised on tales of duty and splendor. The court saw in her the possibility of renewal, a chance to finally secure succession. Physicians, however, prepared her chamber with the same ritual precision as they had for Maria Antonia. The cycle was about to repeat. The wedding ceremony itself was a display of Baroque excess, gold-threaded vestments, choirs thunderous with te deums, courtiers resplendent in silks. But beneath the grandeur lay dread. Those closest to the king knew what awaited the bride on her wedding night, and when the screams echoed through the corridors of the palace, it confirmed their worst fears. What had been celebrated as a union of dynasties was, in truth, another descent into nightmare. For Maria Isabel, the marriage was a slow unraveling of body and spirit. For Ferdinand, it was another chapter in the grotesque theater of shame and cruelty. And for Spain, the spectacle of royal marriages became a bitter metaphor, repeated rituals of hope ending in disaster, each promising continuity but delivering only trauma. The desired one had returned, but the promise of his reign was already poisoned. Spain would endure not just political tyranny, but the consequences of a king whose private obsessions bled into the governance of an entire nation. The young Queen Maria Isabel never recovered from her wedding night. What should have been a moment of union instead resembled a surgical ordeal. Blood-stained sheets and broken furniture bore witness to the violence of their first encounter. Courtiers whispered of her sudden pallor, her stammer, her flinches whenever Ferdinand entered a room. Within months, the bright-eyed Portuguese princess had become a shadow of herself, walking Madrid's corridors with a haunted expression. Physicians described her symptoms in the language of the age: hysteria, nervous exhaustion, melancholia, but what they were truly witnessing was trauma. She woke screaming from nightmares, called her husband a monster in her sleep, and clutched rosary beads as if they were weapons. Laudanum, that ubiquitous balm of royal courts, dulled her terror but eroded her health. Those close to her knew she was not merely ill, she was breaking. Ferdinand, rather than seeing his wife's collapse as the result of his deformity, read it as insult. Her terror became, in his paranoid mind, a conspiracy. He imagined her correspondence filled with mockery of his condition, her pale silence a form of rebellion, her reluctance to bear his touch an act of treason. He had her letters intercepted, her food tasted, her chambers searched. The queen was not only a prisoner of her marriage but of her husband's suspicion. In the midst of this misery came a cruel twist. Maria Isabel began to show signs of pregnancy, her belly swelling, her body shifting, her moods fluctuating. Court and country rejoiced. Finally, an heir seemed possible. But after months of expectancy, physicians realized the truth: there was no child. The queen was suffering from a phantom pregnancy. Her body, driven by psychological torment and desperate hope, had mimicked the signs of life. When the deception was revealed, the palace fell silent. The king raged, accusing his wife of deliberately humiliating him, of feigning pregnancy to mock his virility. He ordered further examinations, called in foreign physicians, demanded rituals and remedies. But each cycle ended the same: a flicker of hope, followed by the crushing weight of failure. For Ferdinand, these false pregnancies were both proof of his paranoia and fuel for it. For Maria Isabel, they were yet another form of torture, as her body betrayed her just as his had betrayed him. Spain, meanwhile, reeled. Abroad, its American colonies fought for independence, and rebels from Mexico to Argentina pointed to the king's failures as divine judgment. Pamphlets depicted Ferdinand as impotent in both body and rule, a tyrant unable to govern his own house, let alone a continent. At home, liberals who had once dreamed of constitutional reform watched in despair as Ferdinand tightened censorship, revived the Inquisition, and filled dungeons with those accused of sedition or slander. Even private jokes whispered in kitchens could bring arrest if they touched on the king's shame. The private tragedy of a marriage had metastasized into a national disease. The palace had become a laboratory of humiliation and despair, its shadows filled with whispers of failed heirs and phantom births. Maria Isabel drifted deeper into illness, her body weakened by laudanum and grief. Courtiers began to predict her early death, as though she were already marked. And indeed, the prediction proved true. By 1818, after only 2 years of marriage, the young queen succumbed to what physicians politely called nervous exhaustion. In reality, it was the slow erosion of a woman crushed by trauma, suspicion, and despair. Her last words, whispered to her confessor, were not of duty or legacy, but of gratitude, for death, she said, had finally freed her. By 1819, Ferdinand's court was weary of funerals and whispers. 2 young queens had already gone to their graves, and the question of succession loomed like a specter over Spain. The king, now in his mid-30s, turned once more to matrimony. His choice was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a princess of 24, older than her predecessors and trained in the stern discipline of a Saxon court. Her family's fortunes were fragile, and the Spanish marriage promised both prestige and financial reprieve. Whatever rumors surrounded Ferdinand's condition, necessity outweighed fear. Unlike Maria Antonia or Maria Isabel, Maria Josepha did not arrive with naive dreams of romance. She had been carefully briefed by Saxon physicians, who warned her of peculiarities in the Spanish king. She came prepared, not with illusions, but with strategies. In her baggage she carried medical instruments, notes from consultations, even a personal physician skilled in treating marital difficulties. To her, the marriage was not a leap into love but a clinical challenge, a problem to be managed with discipline and care. The wedding was subdued, reflecting not only Spain's political exhaustion but also the court's growing dread of another doomed union. Gone were the extravagant displays of Ferdinand's earlier marriages. The ceremonies were respectful, even grand, but muted, as if everyone sensed they were repeating a ritual fated to end in disappointment. The bride herself appeared calm, even stoic, her face betraying little of what she must have known awaited her. The pattern of their marriage soon emerged. Intimacy became a scheduled procedure, arranged with the precision of a medical experiment. Sessions were supervised by physicians, aided by contraptions, and followed by detailed notes. Maria Josepha treated the matter with the detachment of a scientist, recording times, techniques, failures. She endured, not with the terror of Maria Antonia or the despair of Maria Isabel, but with a cold endurance that masked inner sorrow. She was less a wife than a participant in a study, her body another instrument in Ferdinand's quest for an heir. This detachment enraged the king. To him, Maria Josepha's calm was another form of mockery. He saw in her clinical composure a lack of reverence, an unspoken judgment. He began to suspect she was documenting his failures not for herself, but for foreign spies. His paranoia expanded. He intercepted her letters, scrutinized her correspondence with Saxony, and raged at the thought that his secret was being dissected in courts across Europe. In his mind, she was not a partner but a betrayer, just as his tutors, courtiers, and previous wives had been. Meanwhile, Spain itself crumbled further. The empire was unraveling overseas, one by one, colonies in the Americas declared independence, severing ties with the crown that had neglected them. Armies marched under new banners while Ferdinand obsessed over bedchambers. Cabinet meetings were postponed for health matters, decisions delayed because the king was engaged in another round of remedies and rituals. Diplomats wrote home in despair. The monarch was consumed not by governance but by his own monstrous fate. Yet, in 1829, a miracle seemed to arrive. Against all expectation, Maria Josepha conceived. The court erupted in joy, Spain dared to hope, and Ferdinand himself trembled with pride and terror. For the first time, it seemed his private curse had been broken. But fate was merciless. At 7 months, the queen suffered complications, likely placental abruption, though physicians of the time could not name it. Ferdinand, true to form, disrupted treatment by insisting on the presence of mystics and alchemists alongside doctors. The delivery was a nightmare. The infant, a daughter, survived only a few hours. Maria Josepha lingered, her strength fading, before succumbing weeks later to infection and despair. Ferdinand's grief was grotesque. He refused to allow burial, insisting physicians attempt resurrections. For nearly a week, the palace was filled with the stench of decay, courtiers sickened by the sight of a king muttering over corpses. Only when the futility became undeniable did he consent to interment. Once more, the cycle had ended in death, leaving behind only whispers, suspicion, and a throne still without a secure heir. 3 wives were gone. 1 phantom daughter lost. Spain was weaker, poorer, angrier than before. And Ferdinand, hollow-eyed and trembling, still pursued the one thing he could not have, a lineage that would cleanse his shame. By the end of the 1820s, Ferdinand was a broken man, 3 wives buried, no surviving heir, and a kingdom eroding under rebellion and poverty. Yet fate, or rather, dynastic desperation, presented him with one last chance. In December 1829, at the age of 45, Ferdinand married Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, his own niece. She was 23, vivacious, and politically astute, everything his previous wives had not been. But her arrival at the Spanish court carried a secret that would shape the kingdom's future. She was already pregnant. The wedding was a charade, a farce conducted beneath gilded ceilings while everyone in the palace could see the obvious swell of her belly. Ferdinand, however, embraced the fiction with desperate eagerness. He needed an heir more than he needed truth. To acknowledge the child was not as would be to admit the ultimate humiliation, that after decades of suffering and death, the Bourbon line had been preserved not by him, but by another man's seed. So he clung to the lie, presenting himself to Spain as the expectant father of the dynasty's salvation. In October 1830, a daughter was born, Isabella, the future Isabella II. Bells rang across the country, cannons thundered in salute, and Spain briefly exhaled in relief. A Bourbon heir had arrived. But beneath the jubilation, doubts festered. Courtiers whispered, diplomats wrote cautiously worded reports, and Ferdinand himself gazed at the infant with a mixture of adoration and suspicion. He ordered portraits made at every stage of her infancy, studying them obsessively for signs of resemblance. Was her nose Bourbon? Was her gaze too much like Maria Christina's rumored lover? Every gesture of the child became an object of scrutiny for a father who both cherished and doubted her existence. His paranoia reached grotesque extremes. He had genealogists and physiognomists summoned to the palace, demanding proof that Isabella was truly his. They wrote reports so carefully worded they could be read either way, terrified of telling the king something he did not want to hear. Servants spoke of him staring at the baby for hours, searching her face for answers. One lady-in-waiting recalled how Ferdinand would weep while holding the infant, murmuring, "Mine. Mine," as if words alone could bind bloodlines. Maria Christina, meanwhile, endured a life of surveillance. Ferdinand had peepholes drilled between their chambers, watching her every move. Guards shadowed her daily routines, reporting not only on her letters but on her expressions as she wrote them. Her meals were subjected to elaborate tasting rituals. Servants ate first, then waited half an hour to ensure no slow-acting poison took hold. The Queen described her existence in intercepted letters to Naples as a glass cage, where even her prayers felt monitored. Her attempts to protect Isabella only fueled Ferdinand's suspicions, as he imagined treason in the maternal bond itself. For the court, Isabella's legitimacy was both salvation and danger. To the Bourbon loyalists, she was the future. To Carlists, supporters of Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos, she was an impostor, a bastard child thrust upon the throne. The stage was being set for a civil war that would erupt after Ferdinand's death, the Carlist Wars, wars born of a marriage that had been both a lie and a last hope. As Ferdinand aged, his paranoia metastasized. He conducted midnight raids into Maria Christina's chambers, bursting in with guards to catch her in imagined acts of betrayal. He commissioned hidden passageways in the palace to move unseen, convinced assassins lurked in every shadow. He ordered mirrors angled to detect spies, employed multiple sets of food tasters, and rotated guards so none could conspire against him. The king who could not govern his body had turned governance of his court into a theater of suspicion. And yet, even in the midst of his madness, Ferdinand clung to Isabella with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was both proof of his failure and symbol of his dynasty's survival. In her tiny figure, wrapped in swaddling silk, the king saw his redemption and his curse. He had spent a lifetime trying to overcome his body, and now the crown itself rested upon a child who might not even be his. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand VII was no longer the desired one, nor even the feared tyrant. He was a husk of a man, his body collapsing under years of indulgence, paranoia, and unrelenting stress. Gout gnawed at his joints, leaving him swollen and crippled. Tremors shook his hands so badly he could not sign decrees without assistance. His speech grew rambling, filled with accusations against enemies who did not exist. To the public, he appeared rarely, borne in a carriage like a sick idol. Behind palace walls, his madness deepened. Maria Christina lived as a prisoner in her own chambers, subject to constant inspections. Servants spoke of Ferdinand bursting into her rooms at night with guards in tow, convinced she was hiding lovers or poison. He demanded that physicians examine her before even the most intimate contact, searching for toxins he imagined might seep from her skin. The Queen, only in her 20s, began to age visibly under the strain, her hair thinning, her hands trembling, her once bright demeanor dimmed into mechanical composure. She wrote secretly of feeling as though I live upon a stage, performing even my breathing. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance devoured the court. Ministers were subjected to absurd loyalty tests. The king would make contradictory statements in private and interpret any correction as treason. Guards were rotated daily, tasters doubled, corridors filled with hidden passageways so he could stalk unseen. The palace, once a glittering symbol of Bourbon majesty, became a labyrinth of fear. Diplomats reported home in disbelief, Spain was ruled not by a monarch but by a paranoid wraith, gnawing at his own kingdom like a man chewing his fingernails to the bone. Even Isabella, the child he alternately adored and doubted, could not escape the contagion of suspicion. Ferdinand studied her with hawk-like intensity, commissioning artists to record every detail of her growth, then comparing the portraits to those of himself, Maria Cristina, and suspected lovers. He alternated between kissing the child with tears in his eyes and staring at her as if she were an intruder in his bloodline. To him, she was both salvation and betrayal incarnate. Physicians noted his decline with cautious words. They described him as nervously agitated, weakened in spirit and body, and suffering from malignant gout. In reality, his body was shutting down, overwhelmed by decades of physical degeneration and psychological torment. He often drifted into delirium, calling out for his dead wives, accusing them of betrayal from beyond the grave. At other times, he raged at Maria Cristina, convinced she was conspiring with foreign powers to erase him from history. As death loomed, Ferdinand's paranoia became almost ritualistic. Meals stretched into hours of tasting and waiting. He demanded priests perform repeated blessings on his chambers, convinced the devil stalked him personally. Servants whispered that he would sit for hours before mirrors, muttering to his reflection as if interrogating an enemy. The court tiptoed around him, fearful of triggering one last eruption of suspicion. In September 1833, his body could bear no more. The tremors worsened, his breath grew shallow, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. Physicians diagnosed the familiar scourge of kings, gout, but in truth it was exhaustion, the slow disintegration of a man who had lived every day locked in war with his own flesh. His final days were a blur of pain and delirium. He raved about assassins in the corridors, begged for remedies long proven useless, and whispered orders for investigations that would never be carried out. When he finally died, it was almost anticlimactic. No thunderclap, no grand scene, just a body giving out after a lifetime of battles against itself. He was 49 years old. Spain had been left poorer, fractured, and humiliated, its colonies gone, its people exhausted. And yet the throne was not empty. At his deathbed stood the child he had both cherished and doubted, Isabella II, the heir whose very legitimacy would plunge Spain into civil war. The king who had lived in suspicion left behind a legacy of suspicion. His paranoia had outlived him, seeded into the soil of Spain, waiting to bloom in conflict. When Ferdinand VII died in September 1833, the official record gave the cause as complications from gout. But behind closed doors, the physicians who had spent decades tending to his peculiar condition prepared for one final duty, the autopsy. It was not only a medical task but a political one, for in Ferdinand's body lay secrets that Spain, and indeed Europe, had whispered about for decades. The examination revealed what many had long suspected yet few dared to record. The king's organ, grotesquely enlarged and deformed, measured nearly 14 inches in length. Its base was narrow, tapering like a reed, but it swelled into bulges and curvatures that made normal function impossible. The tissues bore scars, evidence of repeated attempts at self-surgery, desperate efforts Ferdinand had made since youth to reshape himself, to wrest control from the cruel joke of nature. What he had inflicted on himself in secret had only worsened the deformity, deepening both his physical agony and psychological torment. The physicians, bound by oath and fear, documented their findings in meticulous drawings and clinical notes. They wrote of abnormalities unseen in any other man, of a condition that defied natural classification. One compared the organ to a weapon forged by a drunken smith, both absurd and terrifying in form. Yet these records were never meant for public eyes. The Church intervened, declaring the material too scandalous, too dangerous, too humiliating to be released. The body part itself, preserved in spirits, was sealed away in Vatican archives, where it remains hidden even now, a grotesque relic of royal decay. For those physicians, the act of preservation carried a strange symbolism. They were not only conserving a specimen but entombing a reign. Ferdinand's rule had been as warped and destructive as his body, swollen with cruelty, bent by paranoia, incapable of healthy creation. To look upon that organ was to see, in physical form, the distortion of an entire dynasty. Meanwhile, Spain prepared its rituals of mourning. Bells tolled across the kingdom, masses were held, courtiers wept in choreographed displays. But beneath the solemnity lay unease. Ferdinand had left behind a daughter whose right to the throne was disputed, a brother who claimed the crown, and a nation already fracturing into factions. The Carlist Wars, bloody and bitter, erupted almost immediately, as though the king's paranoia had seeped into the veins of the realm itself. Ferdinand achieved in death what he had never managed in life, a kind of immortality. Yet it was not the immortality of glory, but of grotesque curiosity. He would be remembered not for his victories, he had none, nor for his statesmanship, he had none, but for the obscene relic locked in a vault, whispered about by historians and gossiped about in shadows. The physician who stitched his corpse shut, the last man to touch the body of the desired one, must have understood the terrible irony. Here was the flesh that had defined a reign, an organ both too much and too little, a weapon that had never conquered but had destroyed nonetheless. To preserve it was to preserve a warning, that the intimate failures of one man could become the calamities of a kingdom. Ferdinand VII was gone, but Spain did not breathe easier. His death in 1833 left behind not stability, but a kingdom ready to tear itself apart. At the center of the storm stood Isabella II, barely a year old, a child proclaimed queen. Her right to rule was immediately contested by Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, who declared her illegitimate and claimed the throne for himself. Thus began the Carlist Wars, a brutal struggle that would scar Spain for decades, pitting family against family, neighbor against neighbor, in the name of competing dynasties. The irony was sharp. For decades Ferdinand had obsessed over producing an heir, subjecting wives to torment, rituals, and indignities, only to leave behind a daughter whose very legitimacy was doubted. His paranoia had become prophecy, the succession crisis he feared had indeed arrived, but not through poison or conspiracy. It was born of his own failures, of a body that had betrayed him and a mind that had poisoned those closest to him. Isabella II would reign, but never in peace. Her childhood was marked by factional violence, her rule constantly shadowed by accusations of illegitimacy, her own life a mirror of the dysfunction she inherited. Spain itself slipped further into decline. Its American colonies were gone, its economy shattered, its monarchy a symbol of ridicule rather than reverence. The empire that had once spanned continents was reduced to a fragile shell, clinging to relevance while Europe surged forward into a new age. Historians often struggle to measure the impact of a single man on the fate of nations. But Ferdinand VII is a chilling reminder of how personal deformity can become political destiny. His grotesque anatomy shaped not only his private life but his character, insecure, paranoid, cruel. Those traits, in turn, infected his marriages, his court, his policies, and finally his kingdom. The man who could not master his own body tried to master Spain instead, and in doing so, broke it. The preserved organ, hidden in the Vatican's vaults, is more than a medical specimen. It is a symbol, a physical embodiment of a reign that was swollen, twisted, and ultimately destructive. Few rulers have left behind such a literal relic of their failures. Few reigns have so perfectly mirrored the deformities of the man at their center. Ferdinand wanted to be remembered as El Deseado, the desired one. Instead, history remembers him as a cautionary tale, a king whose most intimate shame became his kingdom's calamity. His wives died in despair, his people in rebellion, his empire in ruins. Spain would stagger into the modern era wounded and diminished, bearing the scars of a monarch whose curse was not only genetic, but national. In the end, Ferdinand achieved the immortality he sought, though not the kind any king would desire. His name endures not in triumph but in whispers, of a grotesque relic sealed in darkness, of a reign marked by cruelty and cowardice, and of a people who suffered for the deformities of one man. His story is not just that of a failed king, but a warning, that private dysfunction, when crowned, can become a nation's ruin. History often buries its grotesqueries. Kings are remembered for wars, treaties, or grandiose palaces, not for the flesh that betrayed them. Yet Ferdinand VII refuses to be hidden. His body, warped by centuries of inbreeding, shaped not only his marriages but his monarchy. His deformity was not incidental, it was the silent hand guiding cruelty, paranoia, and despair. In him, anatomy became destiny. The physicians who preserved his organ may have thought they were conserving a medical curiosity. In truth, they preserved a metaphor. Within that jar of spirits lies the story of a kingdom undone by shame, a dynasty corrupted by incest, and a man who could never separate his private humiliation from his public rule. Spain did not merely suffer under a tyrant, it suffered under the tyranny of one man's body. And yet, it is tempting, dangerously tempting, to view Ferdinand as a monster, and thus dismiss him as an aberration. But he was also a victim, of his lineage, of expectations he could never meet, of a system that placed divine authority on men unfit to bear it. His cruelty was real, his paranoia devastating, but behind it all was a boy mocked in corridors, a man terrified of being less than the godlike figure his crown demanded. This is the tragedy of absolute monarchy, that the private failings of one man could ripple outward, reshaping the fate of millions. A malformed organ became a malformed reign. A king's shame became a nation's ruin. The wars, the deaths, the despair of his subjects, all were, in part, consequences of a deformity whispered about but never named in official chronicles. Perhaps this is why his preserved anatomy remains sealed away in the Vatican, a relic too unsettling for public eyes. It is not merely obscene, it is accusatory. It forces us to confront how fragile civilization is when built upon bloodlines, when entire nations hinge on the biology of a single man. Ferdinand sought to be remembered as the desired one. Instead, he endures as something stranger, a warning. His story reminds us that history is not always made by generals or philosophers, but sometimes by the cruel lottery of flesh and bone. So when we speak of Spain's decline, of empires crumbling and wars unfurling, we should also remember the silk sheets of a royal bedchamber, the whispered jokes of courtiers, the desperate prayers of queens. In those private humiliations lay the seeds of public catastrophe. And somewhere, in a hidden vault, the preserved remains of a king still float in silence, a grotesque monument to the idea that sometimes, the most intimate failures echo loudest through history. And so ends the tale of a dynasty drowned in secrets too dark to be spoken aloud. A historical tragedy, a royal scandal, and an empire consumed by shadows. If you wish to uncover more forgotten truths, more historical drama and noble scandals that shook the world, stay with us. You are watching The Empire's Long Night, where history never sleeps.